There is something deeply unsettling about amusement parks after the lights go out. When the music stops and the crowds go home, these places of joy quickly turn into silent, decaying monuments. But for some people, that decay is exactly what draws them in. Back in 2011, two of my closest friends, Trevor and Kevin, loved late-night adventures. We spent so many weekends looking for creepy, abandoned places to explore. We always wore sturdy clothes to protect ourselves from debris. The absolute worst experience happened when we decided to visit the Joyland amusement park in Wichita, Kansas, which was a forgotten park in a typical suburban area. Since we lived only 10 minutes away, we figured it was our next destination. We packed our backpacks and grabbed our flashlights. Today, most of the park has been torn down, but back then, the buildings and rides were still standing. When we arrived, we decided to pull our car up onto a quiet side road right next to the parking lot, since it seemed a lot less sketchy than pulling directly into the lot. To be safe, Kevin drove the car onto the grass right next to the thick woods bordering the park because we did not want a passing cop to spot us. Kevin led the way, while Trevor and I followed behind, talking to each other and joking about how much more eager Kevin was to move ahead than we were. We kept our voices low because we never knew if there might still be security patrolling the area. We wanted to make sure our car would be hidden from view if a cop drove past. Trevor and I were whispering and joking about how Kevin was so much more eager to move ahead than we were. Walking inside, we saw dozens of old carnival shacks that once held games and concessions. Now they were completely ransacked, trashed with empty cans and sprayed with graffiti. It was exactly what you would expect to see in a park abandoned for years. Even though the park was surrounded by suburbs, it was encased by dense woods in almost all directions, so instead of traffic, all we heard were night insects. We walked deeper into the park and found another carnival game stand. This one was in slightly better shape, with the painted cartoon characters still visible, but on the ground, it was nothing but rubble and litter. Suddenly, a sharp sound shattered the quiet night. It was the sound of a glass bottle breaking nearby. We froze, our hearts instantly racing. We turned in the direction of the sound, realizing it had come from one of the larger buildings. We wanted to see what was inside, but we were also hesitant because of the darkness. Perplexed and shaken, we walked toward what was once the Wacky Shack attraction. That was when we stopped dead in our tracks. In the corner of the structure was a person standing completely still, facing the wall. I whispered to Trevor and Kevin that we needed to back away slowly. There was clearly something wrong with this person, and we did not want them to hear. We started to take careful steps backward, trying our best not to make any noise. But just like in a horror movie, either Kevin or Trevor stepped on an empty beer can. The loud crunch echoed through the empty park. The silence in the park made the sudden noise feel 10 times louder than it actually was. Instantly, the person standing in the corner reacted. They spun their head around to look directly at us, and the speed at which they turned really scared me. It was almost like a deer catching a scent. We could now see it was a man, and he had a completely deranged, vacant look on his face. He did not say a word. We immediately turned around and walked toward the woods. We did not run, because we did not want to trigger him to chase us. But as we reached the trees, Kevin looked back and muttered a curse. We looked back and saw the man standing completely stiff next to a tree in the distance. Running was our only option now. We bolted through the dark trees as fast as we could. We could hear the sound of our own heavy breathing as we ran through the brush. It did not take long before we reached our car. We screamed at Kevin to unlock it as he fumbled for his keys. The second the locks clicked, we threw ourselves inside and closed the doors. Looking out the windows, we could all see him again. This time, he was standing completely stiff like a statue, hunched over near the edge of the tree line. Kevin started the engine, hit the gas, and we drove off. While that was terrifying, there are other predators who do not hide in abandoned parks. Sometimes, they operate in broad daylight right under our noses, looking for vulnerable victims. A few years after that, I was taking my family on a long road trip to South Florida. It was a long 2-day drive, and my kids were getting restless. I saw a sign for an amusement park on the parkway, so I figured I would treat them for a couple of hours. We followed our kids, 7-year-old Tommy and 5-year-old Trish, as they ran ahead. I had to admit, this was a pathetic-looking park, with more than half of what appeared to be attractions and games boarded up. The afternoon sun was already beginning to set, leaving long shadows across the concrete paths. But as long as the kids were happy, that was all that mattered. Tommy was running far ahead, pointing at a ride in the dark. Suddenly, he made an unexpected left turn and went completely out of sight. My wife and I screamed for him, but he did not return. A cold panic washed over me as I told my wife to wait there with Trish. I ran as fast as I could to chase after him, but I could not find him anywhere. I ran to the nearest park employee and gave them a description of my son so they could call for him on the loudspeaker. In the meantime, I kept running all over the park searching. Suddenly, I stopped dead in my tracks and felt my heart drop. Over by a wall of bushes next to a building, I saw Tommy. He was talking to someone hidden inside the foliage, and then it looked like he was suddenly pulled directly into the bushes. I screamed his name and sprinted forward. There was nobody around to help me. I got to the bushes and heard Tommy speaking to someone. I pushed my way through and saw my son being pulled. My heart was hammering in my chest as I scrambled through the dense foliage to reach him. I grabbed him and pulled back with all of my strength. I felt a strong resistance on the other side. I could tell someone else was on the other side of another layer of bushes pulling him, but quickly, whatever it was let go, and I pulled Tommy into my arms. I told him to wait there as I pushed my way through to a small opening surrounded by trees. There was no one in sight, and I had no idea how they had gotten away so quickly. I took Tommy back to the public area of the park, putting my hands on his shoulders and asking who he had been walking with. The thought of what could have happened if I had been just a few seconds later made me physically ill. He said he was following an older man named George. I took him to the front entrance and had him describe George to the workers. Then we promptly left the park and went straight to a hotel. But sometimes these predators do not just visit these parks to find victims. Sometimes they live in them. A few years ago, a man who used to work at Thrillville, USA, decided to revisit his old abandoned workplace. The park had closed in 2007, and on a cloudy evening in 2009, he decided to check out what had become of it. He pulled into the empty parking lot. The grass was overgrown, waving in the breeze as a storm approached. Sneaking in was easy because there were no fences. He began walking around, taking pictures with his Canon camera because he had a passing interest in photography. The place looked completely different than it did when he used to work there under the bright lights. Suddenly, he heard a scuttling sound behind him. He could not tell if it was a person or an animal, but when he turned, the path was empty. He pressed onward, snapping photos of the decaying rides, including the old yellow slide covered in mud stains. Eventually, he decided to check out the abandoned restrooms. He stepped into the pitch-black men's room and had to use his camera flash to see. He took a photo of the sink, and the bright flash illuminated the room. But then, he heard a tiny metallic ting. He called out, asking if anyone was in there, but there was no response. He walked to the first stall, pushed the door open slowly, and took a picture. It revealed nothing but an old toilet. He moved to the second stall, but this time, he had trouble drawing up the nerve to take the picture. He wanted to turn around and run right then, but curiosity kept his feet planted on the cold floor. He hesitated for about 5 seconds before he finally pressed the button. The camera flash went off, and in that brief moment of light he saw a tall, looming figure standing directly in front of him. The man screamed, slammed the stall door shut, and ran as fast as he could back to his car. Safe inside, he checked the picture on his camera. It showed a figure, probably 6'3", standing right in front of the toilet, but the face was completely blurry. Shaken, he scrolled through his other photos, only to find something even more disturbing. In 4 out of the 10 photos he had taken, a person was visible in the distance, staring directly at him. In 2 pictures, the person was hiding in the woods, and in 2 others, they were lurking behind the rides. They had been stalking his every move the entire time. He never downloaded those photos to his computer, and the camera is still buried in his attic today. He immediately packed up his things and vowed never to return to that park again. These stories remind us that the most dangerous things in abandoned places are not ghosts. They are real, living people waiting in the shadows. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. I worked at a CVS pharmacy open 24 hours a day. I had been there for 3 years and was one of the higher-ups. I agreed to take on the overnight shifts because I believed it would help my chances of getting a promotion and kept my boss happy. Only one employee worked the midnight to 8 a.m. shift, as that was all that was needed. The pharmacy closed early, and the store was dead until business picked up at 9 in the morning when the daytime staff arrived. The 2 evening shift employees before me would leave as soon as my shift started, so I was completely alone in the building for 8 hours. Since there were so few customers, my job duties varied from running the cash register to simply restocking the shelves. We had an electronic beeper at the front entrance that would go off whenever a customer walked through the door. This system was incredibly helpful because it alerted me while I was working in the back aisles, so I would know exactly when to head back to the front register. A few hours into my shift on this particular night, I walked back to the front counter to check my phone, which I had left charging near the register. When I picked it up, I noticed a new voicemail notification from an unknown number. I opened the message and listened to it, but the audio was incredibly strange. It was a highly distorted, muffled voice, and I could not even tell if it belonged to a man or a woman. The sound quality was so bad that I could not understand a single word, and the automated transcription on my phone was completely blank. I figured it was just some random spam call and decided to ignore it. Everyone gets weird calls like that from time to time, so I put my phone back down on the counter and went back to stocking shelves in the middle of the store. But as I was working, my phone started vibrating repeatedly in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a rapid succession of text messages from the same unknown number. The first message said to call back when you can. The second message read, "I know you are at work and I am coming to visit." The third one asked, "What time are you working until?" I had no idea who this could be, and it was starting to make me feel very uneasy. I texted back and immediately asked, "Who the hell is this?" I saw the typing bubble pop up for about 20 seconds, but then it vanished without a reply. I was definitely unnerved, but I had to finish my work, so I pushed the fear aside and kept stocking. Eventually, the front door beeper went off, alerting me that someone had entered. I walked back to the front register and waited, but I did not see anyone walking around the aisles. I stood there for a long time, scanning the empty store, but it was completely quiet. I assumed it was just a glitch or a draft of wind, so I went back to stocking. At around 2 a.m., I brought a new cart of beauty products to the second aisle. As I did, I noticed a woman standing in the corner of the very next aisle, looking down at the bottom shelf. I stepped into her aisle and asked if she needed help finding anything, but she completely ignored me. She did not look up or acknowledge me at all. It felt incredibly awkward, so I decided to leave her alone and walked back to the front register. That was when my phone started vibrating again. The unknown number was spamming me with a series of nonsensical messages. Then, one message arrived that made my heart stop. It simply said, "I am here." I decided I had had enough of this game, so I called the number back. Instantly, I heard a phone ringing from inside the store, right from the beauty aisle. My heart started beating incredibly fast, and my throat went tight. I ended the call, and the ringing in the aisle stopped immediately. I ran back to the safety of the front counter. I did not want to call the police over a prank, so I called my best friend instead. He picked up immediately, and I asked him if he knew any brunette girls who had my number and would pull a sick stunt like this. He guessed a few names, but none of them matched her body shape. My friend told me I was being paranoid, and that I should just go talk to her. I hung up and prepared to walk back over there. But as I looked up, I saw her head slowly peer around the corner of the beauty aisle. She was kneeling on the floor because the shelf was low. The first thing I saw was bright red blood trickling down her cheeks. She was smiling a wide manic smile and making a quiet, choked-up laughing sound. She had deliberately cut her cheeks right next to her lips. I suddenly recognized her face. She was a woman in her late 30s, with severe mental health issues, who had harassed me on Instagram before using fake accounts. As far as I knew, she was supposed to be in a psychiatric hospital because she was considered dangerous. She must have gotten my number from my public social media profile. Seeing her bloody, smiling face made me want to throw up. I yelled at her to get away or I would stab her, which was a total bluff. I ran to the back of the store and hid in a small hallway. I only breathed a sigh of relief when I finally heard the front door chime go off, signaling she had left. I checked the store to make sure she was gone and called the police. They took a report, watched the camera footage, and promised to patrol the area. I blocked her number, and I can only hope her family or doctors found her. I used to work the dairy section of a grocery store, and it was the worst job I ever had. The work was physically exhausting, requiring constant heavy lifting of heavy milk crates, dealing with disgusting expired products, and shivering in the freezing cold. The main dairy cooler was a massive walk-in refrigerator, located in the back warehouse area of the store where all the extra stock was kept. Because the cooler was so large and hidden from the main sales floor, I would often go in there just to hide and relax. The supervisors on duty never thought to look for me inside the freezer. I always made sure to bring a thick black hoodie to work, just so I would not freeze while I was avoiding my duties. One night, I was scheduled to work until 10 p.m. The store usually got very quiet after 9, but a strict supervisor named Mr. Senko was on duty, and he was an absolute pain to deal with. He was constantly checking up on the employees, so after stocking the milk cartons one last time, I wheeled my empty cart back to the warehouse area. I wanted to slip into the dairy cooler to hide out for the last hour of my shift. As I walked toward the heavy insulated doors, I glanced through the glass window. For a fraction of a second, I saw a pale human face looking back at me from the dark interior. But as soon as I blinked, the face ducked down and completely vanished from my view. I pushed the heavy doors open and stepped inside, immediately greeted by a blast of freezing air and the roaring sound of the massive refrigeration fans. Stacks of wooden pallets, plastic milk crates, and cardboard boxes were piled high all around the room. I looked around carefully, but I could not see anyone. There were plenty of hiding spots behind the giant columns of inventory, but the space seemed empty. I walked to my usual spot, sat down on an empty crate hidden behind a large stack of boxes, and pulled my hood up to stay warm. Suddenly, the overhead lights in the cooler shut off, plunging the room into near total darkness. The only light came from the warehouse outside, filtering through the glass window of the doors. My heart jumped into my throat. I immediately assumed that Mr. Senko had figured out I was hiding in there, and had shut off the lights to make me come out. I stood up and stepped out from behind the boxes to head for the exit, but as I walked toward the doors, I froze in absolute terror. Standing directly in front of the two cooler doors, blocking my exit, was the silhouette of an incredibly tall person. This could not be Mr. Senko because he was a very short man, and this figure was at least a foot taller than me. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered back on. The figure was completely gone, and the space in front of the doors was empty. I walked over and waved my hand through the air, feeling an icy, overwhelming presence. I bolted through the double doors, slammed them shut, and turned off the light. I checked through the window, but the dark room was empty. I threw my apron on the floor, clocked out early, and ran to my car. I did not care if I got fired, I just needed to get out of there. I do overnight stock shifts for various local Lowe's home improvement stores. My job is highly mobile, and I simply go to whichever specific location needs me for the night. This usually depends on which store is receiving the largest shipment of inventory. My duties include unloading massive delivery trucks, operating heavy forklifts through the warehouse and sales floor, and stocking the shelves before the stores open to the public. On one quiet night, the only other person in the entire store with me was a truck driver named Paul. Once we finished successfully unloading his truck, he helped me sort the heavy packages in the back receiving room. After that, he said goodbye and drove off to make another pickup, leaving me completely alone in the massive, quiet building. I went about my normal routine, scanning new shipments with my handheld inventory gun, and driving the forklift to transport the items out to the main retail floor to stock the empty shelves. I was scanning items in the back when a loud crash made me jump. A large box had fallen from a high stack of pallets. The box was still sealed, so nothing spilled, but as I got closer, I noticed a very strange foul odor in the air. I dismissed it, got the forklift to put the box back, and continued my work. Later, I turned into the paint aisle and saw someone dressed in dark clothing walking at the other end. No one else was supposed to be in the store, and they had no uniform. I yelled at them, and they immediately sprinted down a side aisle. I chased after them, but they disappeared. I returned to the warehouse, and another loud crash came from the exact same pile of pallets. I grabbed a tall ladder and climbed up to inspect the stack. At the top of the boxes, I discovered a hidden space enclosed by a wall of packages. Crouching inside this cardboard nest was a disheveled man dressed in all black. He was the source of the foul smell. He stared at me and then stood up, lunging in my direction. I quickly scrambled down the ladder, jumped to the floor, and ran to call the police. The police arrived 15 minutes later, but the man had fled. When management checked the security cameras, they discovered he had been living in that secret box fortress for an entire week. He only came down at night to steal food and water, remaining completely unnoticed right above the staff. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. This first story happened to a young woman named Sarah on Thanksgiving Day just about 2 years ago. The reason she remembers that day so clearly is because she was incredibly sick with a terrible respiratory virus that was going around her college campus. By the time Thanksgiving Day actually arrived, she was past the fever stage and she was no longer contagious to other people. But she still felt absolutely miserable. She had deep body chills that made her shake, and she could not go 5 seconds without having a massive coughing fit. To make things worse, she could barely speak at all because her throat was so raw. Before she had gotten sick, she had promised a friend and coworker that she would watch her cat over the holiday weekend. Her coworker was going out of town to visit family, and her cat was quite old and needed to take daily medication. Even though Sarah was feeling terrible, she did not want to go back on her word. She knew how important the medication was for the old cat, and her coworker lived only a short walk away from where they both worked. So she decided she would push through the illness and make the trip. At the same time, she had been talking to another friend about how they both wanted to go play tennis and go bowling sometime soon. They had both played these sports back in high school and really missed it, but the problem was that she kept her tennis rackets and her heavy bowling ball at her father's house. She lived in a very small college dorm room in the middle of a big city, so she did not have enough space to keep her sports gear with her. She also did not own a car because the city had a massive public transportation network that she used to get everywhere. Because she was so sick, she was not able to go all the way back to her father's house to spend Thanksgiving with her family, but she was extremely stubborn and determined to get her tennis rackets and her bowling ball. She only went back to her father's house a couple of times a year, so if she did not get her things on Thanksgiving Day, it would be another few months before she and her friend could play, so she decided to make a plan. She would walk to the light rail station near her dorm and take the train to a station that was much closer to where her father lived. From there, she would ask her brother to drive over and meet her at the station to hand over the tennis rackets and the bowling ball. Then, on her way back home, she would get off the train and take a bus to her coworker's apartment to check on the cat and make sure it got its medicine. It seemed like a simple plan, but the transit system in her city was notoriously irregular, especially on holidays. After she met her brother and got her things, she was standing at a bus stop waiting for the bus that would take her to her coworker's apartment. She was looking at the transit app on her phone, and the map kept telling her that the bus was just 1 minute away. But the bus never showed up. She would refresh the app, and suddenly it would say the next bus was not coming for another 15 minutes. If she had been healthy, she would have just walked the remaining distance to her coworker's apartment, as it was not incredibly far from the train station. But at the time, she was a 19-year-old female who stood at about 5 feet 3 inches tall. She was sick, exhausted, and carrying a heavy 13-pound bowling ball in a bag, along with a couple of tennis rackets and a container of Thanksgiving leftovers her brother had brought her. She had been waiting at the empty bus stop for over 30 minutes. It was now around 9 o'clock in the evening on Thanksgiving Day, and the streets were completely quiet. Because she was alone and coughing constantly, she stood a little bit away from the actual bus shelter, trying to stay out of sight and keep her distance from anyone who might walk by. The city transit system had always been difficult to navigate, but on a major holiday like Thanksgiving, it felt almost completely abandoned. The cold winter air made her throat feel even tighter, and every breath she took seemed to trigger another deep, painful cough. Her hands were shaking as she gripped the straps of the heavy bag containing her father's old bowling ball. The weight of the 13-pound ball was starting to strain her shoulder, and she kept shifting it from side to side, trying to find a comfortable position. She had also been holding 2 tennis rackets under her arm, which kept slipping out of place every time she had to adjust her heavy puffer jacket. The container of Thanksgiving leftovers that her brother had packed for her was tucked inside her backpack, adding even more weight to her small frame. She felt completely exhausted, and all she wanted was to be back in her warm, quiet dorm room safely. But she had made a firm commitment to her coworker, and she was not the type of person to break her promises, no matter how difficult the circumstances became. As she was standing there, a car slowly pulled up to the station. Inside the car was a group of young men, who looked to be in their early to mid-20s. They were talking loudly in a different language and laughing. She assumed they were just a group of friends dropping someone off at the transit station. After a couple of minutes, one of the men got out of the car, and then the vehicle quickly drove away. The transit station was quite large, and she was still standing a good distance away from the actual bench because of her coughing fits. But despite the vast open space, the man who had just gotten out of the car did not go into the station. Instead, he walked directly over to her and sat down on the bench right next to where she was standing. At first, she tried not to think much of it. She did not want to seem paranoid, so she just stared down at her phone, watching the bus arrival time change over and over again. Every now and then, she would lean forward to look down the dark street to see if she could spot the headlights of the bus. A couple of minutes passed in silence. Then, out of nowhere, she felt a heavy weight on her shoulder. The man had suddenly stood up, stepped closer, and wrapped his arm tightly around her. Her mind went completely blank. She was so confused and startled by the sudden physical contact that her body just froze up. She could not move or speak. After a moment of silence, the man mumbled something in a low voice, asking her if she was okay. She managed to quietly whisper that she was fine, and that she was just waiting for her bus to arrive. A couple of minutes later, the man finally let go of her and sat back down on the bench. In her mind, massive red flags were going off, but she kept trying to rationalize the situation to keep herself from panicking. She told ourselves that maybe he heard her coughing so hard and genuinely thought she was sick or having some kind of medical emergency. Or maybe he saw her leaning out to look down the street and thought she was in distress. She knew these excuses were completely irrational, but she was desperately trying to keep herself calm. People might wonder why she did not just run away or scream for help. But the reality was that this man was well over 6 feet tall and easily twice her physical weight. He was also wearing a bandana-style face covering over his nose and mouth. It was near the end of the pandemic era, so seeing someone in a face covering was not entirely unusual. But the way he was acting made it incredibly sinister. They were completely alone at the dark bus stop, and she knew that if she screamed or tried to run with her heavy bags, she could easily provoke him, and there was no one around to help her. She kept her eyes fixed on the screen of her phone, hoping that the bus map would show the vehicle turning the corner onto her street. The battery on her phone was starting to drop quickly because of the freezing temperatures, and she knew that if her phone died, she would have no way of calling for help or checking the transit schedule. She felt completely isolated, and the quietness of the surrounding neighborhood only made the situation feel more intense. The streetlights flickered occasionally, casting long, eerie shadows across the pavement. She tried to take deep, slow breaths to keep her heart rate down, but her lungs felt raw and painful. A few minutes later, the man stood up again. He walked over and put his arm around her for a second time. This time, his grip was even tighter, and he started slowly stroking her back. Fortunately, she was wearing a very thick winter puffer jacket, so she could not feel the direct physical contact of his hand on her back. But the sensation of being held against her will was terrifying. She looked down the road and saw the headlights of her bus, finally approaching in the distance. She decided to stay completely still and just endure those last few moments, thinking that once the bus arrived, the nightmare would be over and she would be safe. When the bus finally pulled up to the curb, She managed to slip out of his tight grip and quietly whispered that her bus was here. The man looked at her and said something in response that made her blood run cold. It was immediately clear from his words that he had absolutely no intention of letting her go, and he was planning to follow her onto the bus. She knew she should have told the bus driver right away when she got on, but she was in a state of sheer panic. Her throat was so raw that she could barely speak a word without coughing violently, and nothing like this had ever happened to her before. When she stepped onto the bus, she purposely chose to stand up near the handrails instead of sitting down. She knew that because of the man's large physical size, he would not want to stand up on a moving bus, and if she sat down first, he would inevitably sit right next to her and trap her in the seat. Her plan worked, and the man went and sat down a few rows away. Once he was no longer looming directly over her, she pulled out her phone and frantically messaged a friend, trying to figure out what she should do next. She considered calling the emergency services, but she knew the bus was quiet and the man was watching her. He would easily hear her speaking to the dispatcher, and she had no idea if he was carrying some kind of weapon. While she had been trapped in his grip at the bus stop, she had already started planning what she would do if he actually followed her onto the bus. She knew she could not get off at the stop near her coworker's apartment. If she did, she would be leading a dangerous stranger directly to the home of her friend, and she would be completely vulnerable in a quiet residential area. She also could not shake the terrifying thought that the group of men who had dropped him off in the car might be driving around nearby, waiting for him. She needed to find a place that was safe, well-lit, and populated. Then, she remembered that the bus stop right before her coworker's apartment was the stop for her workplace. She worked at a restaurant located inside a very large outdoor shopping center. It was around 9:30 in the evening by now. Even though all the retail stores in the shopping center had closed at 9 o'clock, she knew that the entire center had active security guards and surveillance cameras everywhere. She also knew that her coworkers at the restaurant would still be inside the building, finishing up their closing duties for the night. The only downside to this plan was that the front doors of the restaurant would be locked to the public. However, she knew that the back employee entrance would still be unlocked for the staff. To get to that back door, she would have to navigate through an outdoor trash room enclosure first, and then quickly punch in the security code on the keypad of the employee door. It was a risky plan, but it was her only real option. When the bus finally reached her stop, she stepped off, and the man immediately got off right behind her. Before she could even react, he reached out and grabbed her shoulder again, gripping her even tighter than before. She was forced to take tiny, slow steps because of his tight hold on her. She did not want to suddenly start sprinting and alert him, because she knew she was too far away from the restaurant door, and if she ran, he would easily chase her down and catch her before she could get inside. As they walked closer and closer to the shopping center, her mind was racing. She was terrified that she would not be fast enough to break away from his grip, get through the trash enclosure, and punch in the keypad code before he grabbed her again. But as they approached the back entrance of the restaurant, she saw a miracle. The door to the trash enclosure had been propped open, and one of the restaurant chefs and a coworker were standing right there in the doorway, talking with the back employee door held wide open. She knew this was her only chance. As they walked, his grip on her shoulder had loosened just a tiny bit from the motion of walking. She used all of her strength to slip out of his hand and sprinted past him toward the open door. She ran inside and tried to scream to her coworker that this man was following her and that they needed to shut the door immediately. Even though her voice was barely working, her coworker saw the absolute terror on her face and slammed the heavy door shut right away. Not even 2 seconds later, the metal door handle started rattling violently. The man was outside, frantically trying to open the door and banging heavily on the metal frame. She quickly explained to her coworkers as best as she could that she had absolutely no idea who this man was, and that he had been stalking and grabbing her ever since she was at the bus stop. They immediately called the mall security team. While they were waiting for security to arrive, they looked through the windows of the restaurant and could see the man pacing back and forth outside, looking extremely frustrated. After a couple of minutes of pacing, The man slowly walked over to an ice cream shop located directly across the walkway from the restaurant and went inside. Soon after, the mall security guards arrived at the restaurant and asked the young woman a series of questions about what had happened. The coworker, who had been standing at the door when she ran in, was incredibly kind and offered to help. He drove her over to her friend's apartment so she could quickly check on the cat and give it its medicine, and then he drove her all the way back to her home so she would be safe. A few days later, her manager at the restaurant told her that the mall security team wanted to know if she wanted to press formal charges against the man. She told her manager that she was not entirely sure yet, and that she mostly wanted to know what the man's name was and what he had claimed he was doing there that night. But her manager never followed up with her, and she never heard another word about the incident. To this day, she has absolutely no idea what that man's intentions were, though she certainly has her own dark suspicions about what would have happened if she had not escaped. She had honestly forgotten about the entire traumatic event until recently, when that very same coworker asked her if she would be willing to watch her cat again for the upcoming Thanksgiving holiday. That simple question brought all of those terrifying memories rushing back to her. This next story takes us to the early part of December, just about 2 years ago. It involves a young man named Jeremy, who decided to drive up into the mountains to visit an old friend he had not seen in a very long time. For the sake of this story, we will call this friend Scott. Jeremy and Scott had been incredibly close friends since their middle school days, but after they graduated from high school, their lives took very different paths. Scott moved away with his family to a small, isolated mountain town, while Jeremy stayed in New York City to focus on his career. Over the years, the two of them slowly began to drift apart. They never had a fight or any kind of falling out. They simply stopped keeping up with each other's lives as they got busier with their own routines. Back in middle school and high school, Jeremy and Scott had been practically inseparable. They spent almost every weekend together, riding their bikes around the neighborhood, playing video games until the early hours of the morning, and talking about what they wanted to do when they finally grew up. Scott had always been the louder, more energetic one of the duo, always cracking jokes and coming up with wild ideas for things they could do. They had shared so many secrets and dreams, which made the slow drifting apart after graduation feel even more bittersweet. When Scott's family decided to pack up and move to that quiet, isolated mountain community, the distance simply became too much to maintain. Over the next few years, their text messages became shorter and less frequent until they eventually stopped altogether. So, when Scott's name suddenly popped up on Jeremy's phone screen on that cold December morning, it felt like a voice from a completely different lifetime. So when Scott suddenly reached out to Jeremy, out of the absolute blue, and invited him to come up to the mountains for a weekend visit, Jeremy felt a wave of nostalgia and excitement. Scott told him that December was the absolute best time to visit because the heavy snow added a beautiful, rustic charm to the rural mountain town. Jeremy figured it would be a wonderful opportunity to catch up on the old times and see how his childhood friend was doing. The long drive up the mountain was especially slow and difficult because the roads were covered in thick ice, forcing Jeremy to drive with extreme caution. There were barely any other vehicles on the road, and because it was December, the sun set incredibly early, around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. By the time Jeremy finally arrived at the coordinates Scott had sent him, it was already pitch black outside. Scott lived in an older, rustic wooden house built directly onto the side of the steep mountain. The area was extremely rural, with only a few scattered houses nearby, all of them spaced very far apart from one another. It was a great location for skiing, which would have been perfect if Jeremy actually knew how to ski. When Jeremy pulled his car into the long driveway, Scott came walking out of the house to greet him, but the very moment Jeremy saw him, he felt a strange sense of unease. Something about Scott felt completely off. Jeremy had not seen him in several years, so at first, he tried to tell himself that he had simply forgotten what his friend looked like, or how he carried himself. But as they started talking, Jeremy realized that Scott's entire way of speaking had changed. He spoke much slower than he used to, and he would constantly pause for long periods in the middle of his sentences, almost as if he completely forgot what he was trying to say. It was incredibly jarring. Scott helped Jeremy carry his luggage inside the house. The interior of the home was warm, but it was surprisingly empty. There was almost no furniture in the entire place, except for a simple couch, a wooden table, a couple of chairs, and some antique-looking decorations hanging on the walls. Scott explained that Jeremy could sleep on the couch for the weekend, because it was a pull-out sofa that folded down into a bed. Jeremy told him that was perfectly fine with him. Across from the couch there was a very long, dark hallway that led to the back of the house. Scott explained that at the end of this hallway, there was a bathroom and 2 guest bedrooms. He told Jeremy that those rooms were completely empty, because this house had originally belonged to his grandparents, who had recently passed away, and he was now living there entirely by himself. The dark hallway had absolutely no light source at the end of it, and all of the doors to the empty rooms were left wide open. From his spot on the couch, all Jeremy could see was a giant, pitch-black rectangle stretching deep into the back of the house. For some reason, looking at that dark hallway made Jeremy feel incredibly uncomfortable, even though there was nothing visibly dangerous about it. That first night, the two of them sat down and tried to talk about their school days, but the conversation felt incredibly forced and strange. Scott's overall demeanor and social skills seemed to have degraded significantly. He was extremely awkward, and he barely made any direct eye contact with Jeremy during the entire conversation. In fact, Jeremy noticed that Scott's eyes kept drifting past him, staring intently in the direction of that long dark hallway. Jeremy tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the idea that living alone in an isolated mountain house for years could easily make anyone a bit eccentric and socially awkward. When it was finally time to go to sleep, Scott went upstairs to his bedroom, and Jeremy set up the pull-out couch. Before he lay down, Jeremy decided to leave a small lamp turned on near the hallway, because the complete darkness of the corridor was making him feel incredibly nervous. He felt silly for being afraid of a dark hallway in his friend's house, but he could not shake the bad feeling it gave him. He eventually managed to fall asleep. But at around 2 o'clock in the morning, Jeremy was suddenly awakened by a loud thumping sound coming from the ceiling directly above him. He lay perfectly still and listened closely. He quickly realized that the sound was the unmistakable noise of fast footsteps running back and forth across the floorboards upstairs. It sounded like someone was sprinting at full speed from one side of the upstairs room to the other, stopping abruptly and then sprinting back in the opposite direction. This bizarre running went on continuously for about 20 seconds before it stopped completely. Jeremy waited in the silence, expecting to hear a door open, footsteps on the stairs, or some kind of logical explanation, but the house fell completely silent. Feeling deeply creeped out, Jeremy eventually managed to drift back to sleep. The second day of the visit proved to be even stranger and more uncomfortable than the first. Throughout the entire day, Scott seemed completely distracted. He barely spoke a word to Jeremy, he hardly ate any food, and whenever Jeremy asked him if he was feeling okay, or if something was bothering him, Scott would simply nod his head slowly without saying a word. Jeremy could not understand why his old friend was acting this way. After all, Scott was the one who had reached out and invited him up to the mountains for the weekend to catch up and rebuild their friendship. Instead, Jeremy felt like an unwanted intruder in the house. Furthermore, Jeremy counted Scott walking down that long, dark hallway at least 5 times throughout the course of the day. Scott would walk down the hall, disappear into the darkness, and then return a few minutes later. Jeremy never bothered to follow him or check what he was doing, because the bathroom was located at the end of the hall, so he assumed Scott was simply using the restroom. But the problem was that Jeremy never once heard the sound of a toilet flushing or water running during any of those trips. That evening, the weather outside took a turn for the worse. A massive, howling winter snowstorm rolled through the mountains, and the heavy winds slammed against the old wooden house so incredibly hard that the walls actually shook. Despite the strange atmosphere inside, Jeremy actually loved the cozy feeling of being snowed in during a storm. He sat on the couch, scrolled through his phone for about an hour, and then decided to go to sleep. At around 2 o'clock in the morning, Jeremy woke up yet again. This time he did not hear thumping from upstairs. Instead, he heard a very soft, distinct scraping sound. The noise was coming from somewhere downstairs, deep inside that long, dark hallway. It sounded exactly like something heavy was being slowly dragged across the wooden floorboards. Jeremy froze, holding his breath as he listened. The scraping sound continued for a few moments, and then it suddenly stopped. But just as the scraping ended, Jeremy felt a sharp tap on the wall directly behind his head, as if someone had walked up to the wall and flicked it hard with their finger. He quickly turned his head and stared down the long hallway. He had decided not to leave the lamp on that night, so the corridor was completely pitch black. He was terrified to get out of bed and investigate, so he did his best to just roll over to the other side, pull the blankets over his head, and try to block out the noises. He kept telling himself that it was just an old house settling in the wind, and that his mind was playing tricks on him. He eventually fell back asleep, and the next thing he knew, it was morning. The third night of the trip was by far the worst of all. By this point, a thick blanket of unease had settled over the entire house. Jeremy was constantly catching Scott staring at him for uncomfortably long periods without saying anything, almost as if Scott was waiting to see if Jeremy had noticed something unusual. Jeremy seriously considered packing his bags and leaving early, but the snowstorm outside was raging, and the roads were completely blocked. The storm was not expected to clear up until the following morning. After they finished dinner in near total silence, Scott went upstairs to his bedroom early. Jeremy stayed downstairs on the couch, looking at his phone and deeply regretting ever agreeing to come on this trip. Eventually, he set up the pull-out bed and lay down to sleep. Sometime around 2 o'clock in the morning, Jeremy woke up. He did not know what had woken him, but as he opened his eyes, he realized that he could not move a single muscle in his body. He had heard of the phenomenon of sleep paralysis before, but he had never experienced it himself. It was a terrifying sensation, like being fully awake and conscious inside a dead, frozen body. He could move his eyes, but he could not wiggle his fingers, lift his arms, or even make a sound. As he lay there panicking, things got infinitely worse. In the faint light of the room, Jeremy noticed a movement at the far end of the long, dark hallway. At first, it was so dark that he could not tell if his mind was hallucinating. But after a few seconds of intense staring, his eyes adjusted, and he realized with absolute horror what he was looking at. Scott was standing at the very end of the hallway. He was positioned in the shadows, so his face was completely hidden in the darkness, but his distinct tall outline was unmistakable. His arms were hanging loosely at his sides, and he was standing perfectly still, just staring down the hallway directly at Jeremy. It looked like a scene straight out of a horror movie. Jeremy tried to scream out his friend's name, but no sound came from his throat. He tried to thrash his body or twitch his leg, but he remained completely paralyzed. He could only lie there and stare back at the terrifying figure in the dark. Scott stood there, completely motionless, for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly and deliberately, Scott turned to his right and walked into the empty guest bedroom at the end of the hallway, disappearing into the darkness without making a single sound. As soon as Scott vanished, the physical paralysis slowly began to fade away. Jeremy first regained feeling in his fingers, then his arms, and finally he was able to sit up on the couch. He was shaking violently and covered in a cold sweat. He tried to convince himself that it had just been a vivid nightmare or a hallucination caused by the sleep paralysis, but a deep, primal instinct in his gut told him that what he had just seen was completely real. He whispered Scott's name into the dark room, but there was no response. Against every logical instinct in his body, Jeremy got out of bed and slowly forced himself to walk down the dark hallway toward the guest bedroom where the figure had gone. When he reached the doorway and stepped inside, the room at first appeared to be completely empty. But as he looked toward the far corner of the room near the window, his heart stopped. Someone was standing there. In the dim light, filtering through the window from the snow outside, Jeremy could clearly see the silhouette of a person standing in the corner, facing the glass and staring out into the storm. He could not tell if the person was Scott or someone else entirely, but the sight was absolutely horrifying. Jeremy slowly backed out of the room, trying not to make a sound, and then he turned and ran up the stairs to Scott's bedroom as fast as he could. He burst into the room and found Scott lying in his bed, fast asleep and completely knocked out. Jeremy grabbed Scott and shook him awake. Scott looked incredibly confused and irritated, asking Jeremy why he was waking him up in the middle of the night. When Jeremy frantically tried to explain that there was someone standing in the guest room downstairs, Scott flatly refused to get out of bed or go downstairs to check. He would not even look toward the bedroom door. But as Jeremy kept pleading with him, Scott's expression suddenly changed. He did not look scared or surprised. Instead, he looked like he already knew exactly what Jeremy was talking about. Jeremy looked him dead in the eye and demanded to know who was downstairs in the house. Scott just stared back at him for a moment, slowly shrugged his shoulders, and said nothing. At that exact moment, Jeremy decided he was finished. He did not care about the freezing temperatures, the dangerous icy roads, or the fact that it was 2 o'clock in the morning in the middle of a snowstorm. He ran down the stairs, grabbed his bags, and packed his belongings as fast as he humanly could. He kept his eyes locked on the dark hallway the entire time, half expecting that silent figure to come walking out of the shadows at any moment. He just wanted to escape that house immediately. When he finally stepped outside into the freezing night air, he felt an immense sense of relief. He quickly brushed the thick snow off his car windows, got into the driver's seat, and started the engine. As he put the car in reverse and backed out of the long driveway, he made the mistake of looking up at the house one last time. There, standing in the window of the guest bedroom at the end of the hallway, was the clear silhouette of a person, staring down at him through the glass. It was the exact same figure he had seen standing in the corner of the room. That was the last thing Jeremy ever saw of Scott's house. After that weekend, Scott completely stopped responding to Jeremy's text messages. Jeremy became so worried that his friend had been murdered, or that something terrible had happened to him, that he eventually threatened to call the local police to conduct a wellness check on the house. Finally, Scott sent a single, brief reply saying that he was fine, but he never responded to any of Jeremy's messages after that, and Jeremy eventually stopped trying to contact him. Jeremy knew deep down that the person he spent that weekend with was not the same Scott he had grown up with. Whatever had happened to his old friend, and whoever that silent figure was living in the shadows of that isolated mountain house, Jeremy decided it was no longer his problem. But he would be lying if he said the memory of that weekend does not still terrify him to this very day. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. When you are a teenager, there is a certain kind of thrill that comes with the darkness of the night. The world feels completely different when everyone else is asleep. It feels like you have unlocked a secret level of the world, where the streets are empty and the normal rules do not apply. Many of us have snuck out of our houses at some point, seeking adventure, laughter, or just a little bit of mischief. But the reality is that the night does not just belong to adventurous kids. It also belongs to people who operate in the shadows, people who are actively waiting for an opportunity. And sometimes, when you sneak out to find adventure, you end up finding something that will haunt you for the rest of your life. Let us start with a story that takes place in Fort Myers, Florida. Every winter, a young boy and his family would make the long trip down south to visit his aunt and uncle. This was a long-standing family tradition, dating back about 15 years to when his relatives first moved there. For the boy, who was 12 years old at the time, this trip was the ultimate escape from the freezing winter weather back home. It was something he looked forward to every single year. Another reason he loved these visits was his cousin Ashley. Ashley was 13, just a year older than him. Even though he was a young boy and she was a girl, they got along incredibly well. Ashley was always down to do the cool, adventurous things he would normally do with his friends. They were a duo, always looking for excitement. On the first night of this particular winter visit, the family gathered for a big dinner. Afterward, everyone watched a movie together. By the time the movie ended, it was getting late. The parents of both families decided to hang out in the kitchen, opening some wine and catching up. Because of the late hour, they made it very clear that the kids were not allowed to go outside. 12 and 13 were simply too young to be wandering around Fort Myers after dark. But Ashley had other plans. She had heard a rumor from some of the local kids that had her completely captivated. Apparently, people in the neighborhood had been reporting sightings of a massive, 10-foot-long alligator living in a nearby canal. To a couple of young kids, The prospect of finding a real-life monster in the dark was too tempting to ignore. Ashley convinced her cousin to sneak out with her, while their parents were laughing and talking in the kitchen, completely distracted. The two kids quietly slipped out through the back door. The cool Florida night air hit them as they made their escape. To make their adventure even better, they decided their first stop should be the local convenience store. There was a 7-Eleven just down the street, and they wanted to load up on snacks for their trek to the canal. When they walked into the store, they grabbed some chips and drinks and headed to the counter. The cashier looked at the two young kids with a worried expression. As he handed them their change, he told them to be careful out there. He said it with a tone that implied they had no business being out on the streets at this hour. When they stepped back outside, they realized just how right the cashier was. The streets were absolutely deserted. This part of Fort Myers was on the significantly quieter side, and at this time of night, there was not a single car or pedestrian in sight. The silence was heavy. They started walking toward the canal, which was about a 10-minute trek from the store. As they walked, the neighborhood began to change. The manicured lawns started to fade away, and the sides of the road began to get swampier and thicker with overgrown brush. Ashley was walking slightly ahead when she suddenly froze. She did not make a sound, but her entire body went rigid. She raised her hand and pointed down the street, whispering to ask what that guy was doing. The boy looked past her shoulder, and his heart skipped a beat. At the far end of the dark street, directly on the sidewalk, there was the silhouette of a man. He was not walking. He was not looking down at a phone. He was just standing there, completely still, staring straight ahead in their direction. It sent shivers straight down both of their spines. Ashley whispered that this was the only street that led to the canal, unless they wanted to cut through people's private yards, or wade through gross, sewage-filled swamp water. So, despite the bad feeling in their guts, they decided to keep walking. But they slowed their pace, moving with extreme caution, keeping their eyes locked on the unmoving silhouette. They had closed about half the distance between themselves and the stranger when he suddenly turned around. He did not just turn his head. He pivoted his entire body in one swift, mechanical motion, without even taking a peek first. Now he was facing them directly. The two kids stopped dead in their tracks. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the street as they engaged in a bizarre standoff, and then the man lifted his arm and started waving at them. But this was not a normal wave. He was flailing his entire arm back and forth in a frantic, exaggerated motion. After a few seconds of this, the wave transitioned into a come-here motion. He was beckoning them to walk closer to him. That was the breaking point. Ashley and the boy turned on their heels and started running as fast as their legs could carry them, heading back down the street. They got winded pretty quickly and stopped to catch their breath in front of some small yellow house. They sat on the grass of the property for a second, just gathering their thoughts. Ashley told him there are a lot of weird people that live down there, especially in the area they were just walking. Now the boy understood why her parents did not want her out this late alone. They got up after a couple of minutes and started walking back to her house when they saw him again. That guy was at the end of the street, not moving once again. He was as still as he was before, with his arms flat at his sides in an exaggerated, stiff posture. He was standing there like a statue, completely frozen, but this time, he was standing directly under a streetlight, so they could see his features clearly. He looked to be about 40 years old. His hair seemed to be slightly slicked back. His nose seemed to be completely broken, bent sharply to the side, and he was smiling. It was a closed-mouth smile, an extremely wide grin that made him look completely unhinged. Once again he started waving at them, and then, for reasons the boy still does not understand, Ashley raised her hand and waved back. As she did this, the man stopped waving and his smile disappeared instantly. It was replaced by a cold, dead expression. A few seconds later, he erupted into a full-on sprint directly towards them. Ashley started screaming and running. The boy got up off the ground and ran as fast as he could after her. He was in pure shock, which is why he could not get a scream out. They ran through people's yards, hopped over fences, and ran down different streets until they finally made it back to her house. The back door was locked now, so they had to knock, exposing themselves to their parents. They simply said they ran to 7-Eleven to get snacks. While Ashley's parents were more upset than his, they let them off with a warning. But that man's face, lit up under that streetlight, still terrifies the boy 10 years later. Fast forward to our second story, which takes place in a small, quiet town in the middle of Massachusetts. It was one of the last nights of summer, right before the new school year started. 3 friends were having a sleepover, and they decided to sneak out around midnight to walk about a mile to their local high school. In a small town, everything is close, and at midnight the streets are completely empty. They walked in the middle of the road, laughing and joking, completely carefree. It took about 20 minutes to reach the high school. Once there, they laid on the turf field, looking up at the stars and talking for nearly an hour. By the time they decided to walk back, it was close to 1 o'clock in the morning. As they made their way down the road back home, they approached a T intersection. That was when they noticed a car sitting at the stop sign, which was on their side of the road. They could only see the headlights because the rest of the car was blocked by a row of trees. No other cars were coming, yet the vehicle just sat there idling in the dark. The boys continued to approach. Suddenly, the car slowly moved further out, turned in their direction, and began driving past them. They made out the car to be an old white Mustang. As it passed, one of the friends yelled a stupid insult about the car being a slow V6. It was funny for a fraction of a second, until the vehicle slammed on its brakes. The boy felt his heart go into his throat as the car peeled into a fast, aggressive U-turn. He yelled for his friends to run, and they all bolted down the street. They ran onto the joining road, where they first saw the car. As soon as they reached the row of trees, the boy jumped into the thick woods, and his friends did the same. They had about 3 seconds to spare before the white Mustang turned down the road. The driver began slow rolling down the street looking for them. When he did not see them, he stopped. Out stepped 2 large men, one holding a massive metal rod. The boy lay flat in the dirt, covering his mouth to hide his breathing. His heart was beating so hard he thought they would hear it. It was a terrifying feeling of pure vulnerability. The driver began screaming threats into the woods, holding the metal rod, while his buddies scanned the brush. Their eyes passed over the boy's hiding spot multiple times. If they had walked just a few feet deeper, they would have found him. But then, the buddy told the driver to forget it, saying there would be others out tonight. The driver took one last look and hopped back into the car. They sped off. The boys stayed in the woods for several minutes before running all the way home. 2 days later, they found out from local friends that a white Mustang was stolen and involved in a violent robbery in the next town, over the very same night they were chased. The boys could only imagine what those men would have done if they had decided to walk further into the woods. Our third story takes place in 2013. A 16-year-old boy had a strict curfew, but his friend Jose had none. One Saturday night, after his parents fell asleep, the boy snuck out, grabbed his bike, and rode to Jose's house. From there, they biked across town to explore an abandoned brick hospital. The towering building was shut down years ago, and the town never tore it down. They hid their bikes in a bush and hopped the fence. They walked around the building until they found a broken basement window. Jose went in first, and then the boy followed. The basement was empty, filled with boilers and pipes. They found a stairway, pushed through a rusted door, and stepped onto the main floor. Strangely, a few lights were still on. There would be a single flickering light, then a long stretch of pitch-black darkness. It made the place feel incredibly eerie. There was also a loud, high-pitched buzzing sound echoing through the corridors. They began looking into the patient rooms, which were cleared of equipment. But then, they came across a room with a closed door. Jose tried the handle, but it was locked. He noted that patient rooms are not supposed to have locks, meaning something was blocking it. Suddenly, they heard a very light, rhythmic thumping sound from the other side of the door. The boys froze. They stepped into the adjacent room and noticed a cluster of small holes in the crumbling plaster wall. One of the holes went all the way through into the locked room. The boy quietly dropped to his knees and pressed his eye against the small opening. At first it was too dark to see anything, but as his eyes adjusted, his blood ran cold. Standing against the far wall of the locked room was a woman in a long, dirty white dress. She was leaning against the wall, staring directly at the door. He was so terrified he felt sick. He whispered to Jose to look. Jose did, and let out a terrified gasp. They decided to leave immediately, but the boy, driven by curiosity, decided to take one final look. He knelt down and pressed his eye against the hole. This time the opening was completely dark, and then he realized why. The woman had crawled silently across the floor. She was now on her knees on the other side of the wall, pressing her own eye against the tiny hole, looking directly back at him with a massive wide smile on her face. The boy let out a blood-curdling scream. They ran down to the basement, scrambled through the broken window, and pedaled furiously back to Jose's house. The boy went straight home and locked himself in his room. He knows it was not a ghost, but a real dangerous person waiting in the dark. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Children often use drawing as a way of expressing feelings or emotions that they do not quite understand yet. Sometimes they draw a happy family, a sunny day, or a pet. But other times, children simply draw what is familiar to them, and when they do, there might be something far more unsettling going on. This is especially true when a child begins to draw things that they should have absolutely no knowledge of. This is the reality for several parents and teachers who discovered that their children's art supplies were being used to document things that were incredibly disturbing. Our first story begins with a man named Martin and his wife, who are the parents of 2 children, a 6-year-old daughter and a 3-year-old son. Martin shared a highly disturbing experience that he and his wife had discovered recently. Their daughter, who we will refer to as Jess, loved to draw, and she spent hours doing it. To keep her quiet and happily entertained, they made sure she had all the art supplies she could ever need. They had bought her an entire Crayola backpack packed full of markers, colored pencils, crayons, and sheets of construction paper. Jess had piles of drawings kept in her bedroom and in her backpack, and most of them were normal, innocent pictures. However, one afternoon, Martin was cleaning up and found a picture in her room that he was highly confused about. It was a picture of some random-looking woman holding Jess's hand. The detail that stood out was that Martin's wife was blonde, but the woman in the drawing had brunette hair. Martin asked Jess who the woman in the drawing was, and she calmly said it was the woman who would visit her sometimes. It sounded like something a 6-year-old with an imaginary friend would say, so Martin did not worry too much. He asked her what her friend's name was, and Jess said her name was Lucia. This immediately caused a major alarm for Martin. He went to show his wife the picture and asked if it looked like her sister. At first, his wife said it looks like it could be anybody. But when Martin said Jess claimed her name was Lucia, she gave him a telling look, as if she understood exactly who it was. Lucia was the name of his wife's deceased sister, who died before either of the couple's children were born. The couple immediately went to Jess's room and asked her who exactly Lucia was. Jess again said she visits me sometimes. Trying to get more details, they asked what time she usually visits and what they talk about. She responded that she visits at night sometimes when she is drawing. Martin's wife asked Jess to draw another picture of her the next time she sees Lucia, but this time with more details, and Jess agreed. From then on, the couple kept Jess's bedroom door slightly ajar, just so they could hear if she was talking to someone in her room. It was not until a few nights later that while in the kitchen, the couple both heard Jess talking to someone in her room all of a sudden. The two went toward the room quietly to listen to what she was saying. There were long gaps in between what Jess was saying, but she was clearly talking to someone or something that did not appear to be there, answering questions that the parents could not hear being asked. At one point, Jess said, "They asked about you when they saw my picture of you. They want me to draw you again." Then Jess stopped talking completely. That was when Martin and his wife entered the room and asked if she were talking to Lucia again. She nodded her head. They asked where in the room Lucia was, and Jess turned and looked around the room, then focused on the corner and said she is standing right there. Martin and his wife looked in the corner of the room to find absolutely nothing, yet both of them agreed they felt an uneasy feeling in the room and were extremely uncomfortable. Martin's wife said softly to Jess to draw what Lucia looks like right now down to every last detail, and after Jess said, "Okay, Mom," the couple left the room. A short time later, Jess called her mom back into the room, and both Martin and his wife went back. She presented a new picture that confirmed the couple's fears. In this new photo, drawn with a lot more detail, Jess drew Lucia to have blue eyes, a small mole above her lip, and dressed in white. Lucia was buried in white, had blue eyes, and a small mole above her lip. Martin's wife was never close with her sister, having only attended the funeral for a short time, and so Jess had never learned of her deceased aunt, and there were no pictures around the house she could have seen. The couple told Jess they did not want her talking to Lucia anymore. They had a priest come bless the house and ask any spirits to leave in peace, and they had no further instances. While some children draw figures that their parents cannot see, others use drawings to reveal secrets that are much more grounded in real-world danger. This next account was submitted by an art teacher from an elementary school, twice a year with each class. This teacher would hold an activity she called Draw and Tell. This activity had the children draw anything that meant something to them, and then tell the story behind it. In a third-grade class, as most students were drawing pictures of themselves and their families, or pictures with their pets, one quiet boy was drawing what looked like absolutely nothing but wildfire. The other kids at his table were noticeably glancing over and laughing at him as he did it. As the art teacher noticed this, she went over to the boy and asked him why he was drawing fire, reminding him that he was supposed to be drawing something that means something to him. The boy simply said that he knew, and that he was not finished yet, so the teacher let him continue. As the students were finishing up their drawings, the teacher came back to the boy and noticed that he had now added a house to the drawing. The teacher asked the boy to come with her to the hall, and she took the drawing with them. When in the hall, the teacher asked the boy why he was drawing a burning house, as this was completely inappropriate for a draw and tell. The boy replied with absolute and chilling calmness, "No, it is not. This is the house my parents tried to burn down with me in it." The teacher was speechless and did not know what to say. She kept the drawing and told him to take his seat, informing him that they were not going to do the draw and tell presentations after all. When they re-entered the classroom, she sat at her desk for a moment, fighting back tears, and eventually announced to the class that everyone would be taking their drawings home with them instead. She kept the boy's drawing as evidence of the horrific truth he had revealed through his art, immediately realizing she had to report this to the authorities. Sometimes, children use their drawings to try and explain a physical threat that their parents refuse to believe is real. This next story comes from another parent who wanted to remain anonymous. Brad and Jane are the parents of Molly, who was 5 at the time of this happening. Molly was a quiet and well-behaved girl according to her father, which makes this story even creepier. Brad and Jane's bedroom was right next door to Molly's. The night the strange events began is when Molly came to her parents' room and said she was scared that something was in her closet. Brad walked her back to her room and showed her the inside of her closet to assure her that no monsters were in there. The next night, Molly returned to her parents' room, saying there was a monster inside her closet again. This time, Brad and Jane let Molly sleep with them, and the following day, Molly drew a detailed picture of the alleged monster she was seeing and showed it to her parents. Brad stated the picture admittedly creeped both of them out, but till this point, this all just seemed like normal childhood imagination. Until one of the next nights, when Brad and Jane woke up to Molly crying and screaming. They ran to her room to see what was wrong, and she said she was bleeding. She had her shirt lifted up on her back, where what looked like 2 fresh scratch marks were visible. Molly claimed it was the monster that did it. Brad tore the bedroom and the whole house upside down, looking for anybody that could have done it. When the house proved to be empty, Brad and Jane had no choice but to assume Molly probably did it to herself somehow, either intentionally or accidentally. But as time went on and the couple had time to think about it, the chain of events seemed too crazy to just be coincidental. While the couple had Molly ease back into sleeping alone, Molly never changed her story that the monster was the one to scratch her back. To make her feel better about sleeping alone, they moved Molly's furniture to the spare bedroom and made that one her new room. Molly came to her parents' room a couple of other times in the middle of the night, but both times, when asked if she saw the monster again, she said no and that she was just scared. Luckily, no bodily harm was done to her in her sleep again. Our final story was submitted by a young woman named Giovanna, who found a highly disturbing drawing on her desk. She allowed her 7-year-old brother to use her desk to draw on. She found it strange from the beginning that her brother would leave this on the desk in the first place, because normally he would take all his drawings back to his room and hide them. Since he left this one out, she felt like he wanted her to see it. Upon taking a look at it, it looked like an innocent enough family drawing, but then tucked away in the corner was a black figure labeled the Taking Man. The Taking Man was on a swing, but the family did not have a swing set. Underneath the mysterious man labeled Taking Man appeared to be some object which Giovanna thought resembled a window or some kind of door in the ground. She went outside to carefully check out the green lawn for any sort of door or window, but there was absolutely nothing there. A few days later, while in the bathroom across the hall from her brother's room, Giovanna was washing her face when she heard her brother giggling and talking. She went to check on him and saw his door was cracked open a bit. She looked in and saw him on the ground, talking to something under his bed. She quickly opened the door, and her brother got up, sat on his bed, and turned his head to the TV, claiming he was not talking to anyone. The next morning, her brother woke up holding an empty glass, asking if she could fill it with chocolate milk. Giovanna went downstairs to fill his glass and came back up, only to see him fast asleep. She woke him up and handed him the glass, and he insisted that he did not ask for it. She knew he did, so she did not argue and left the glass next to his bed. That night, around 4 in the morning, Giovanna woke up to hear her brother talking again. She went across the hall, peeked inside, and the last thing she remembers is hearing her brother talking to someone and seeing a black shadow in the room. The next thing she remembers is waking up in her own bed the next morning. When confronting her brother the next day, he denied any recollection of talking to anybody. When Giovanna finally told her parents about the drawing and the shadow, they decided to have a talk with him. He told them that the person in the picture is the Taking Man, and he takes things and brings them back. He said he trusted him, and that the Taking Man was his best friend, who also gave him red berries that he thought were cranberries, but added that now the Taking Man would not come back anymore. Giovanna still does not know if what she saw was a dream, but she remembers it vividly. Her brother hasn't spoken of him since. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Imagine living completely by yourself in a small rental house on the edge of town. It was a simple, one-story place located at the end of a quiet, dead-end road. On this entire street, there were only 5 houses, and because of this, night times were incredibly quiet. I worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, so my daily routine was pretty repetitive. I rarely left the house unless I absolutely had to grab groceries or run a quick errand. Visitors were a rare sight for me. My friends always knew to text me before they decided to drop by, so I never really expected anyone to just show up. That is why the first knock on my door stood out so much. It was about 8:45 on a Thursday night. I was sitting comfortably in my living room watching some television when suddenly I heard 4 very firm, deliberate knocks on my front door. I paused for a second, muted the television, and waited. At first, I thought maybe I had just imagined the sound, but then 2 more sharp knocks followed. I stood up and walked slowly toward the front door. Right in the center of the door, there was a small peephole. I stepped up to it and looked through. On my front porch stood a man holding a medium-sized cardboard box. He was wearing a dark jacket and a simple baseball cap. To be honest, he looked completely normal, maybe in his mid-30s. I opened the door, but kept the security chain firmly attached. The moment the door opened slightly, the man immediately spoke up. He told me he had a delivery that required a signature. He then looked down at a small handheld electronic device and read a name out loud. The problem was, it was not my name at all. It was not even close. I looked at him and said that he had the wrong address. He looked down at the box, then back at his device, and then directly at me. He read the address out loud, and this time, it was my exact address, word for word. I shook my head and told him that absolutely nobody by that name lived at this address. The man just stood there and stared at me for a second or two longer than was necessary. It felt incredibly awkward. Finally, he said that he must have been given the wrong information, and that he would take the package back to his truck. I watched through the window as he walked back down my driveway. I expected to see a delivery van or some kind of car parked nearby, but there was absolutely nothing. He just walked past my mailbox and turned the corner at the end of the road. I could not see where he went after that. I shut the door, locked it, and went back inside. I tried to tell myself it was probably just a delivery driver working for a small company, or maybe a contractor using their own unmarked vehicle. It seemed like a logical explanation, so I tried to let it go. But the very next night, at almost the exact same time, around 8:45, the knocks came again. This time, there were 3 of them. I felt a sudden spike of anxiety. I did not open the door this time. Instead, I went straight to the peephole to see who was outside. It was the exact same man, wearing the same dark jacket, and holding the exact same cardboard box. I refused to open the door. I just spoke loudly through the wood, telling him that he had already come by the night before, and that nobody by that name lived here. There was a long, heavy silence. Then the man spoke up, saying that he really just needed a signature, and that his system showed the package absolutely had to be delivered tonight. I told him firmly that I was not going to sign for a package meant for someone I did not know. Another long pause followed. Then, he simply said okay, and took a step back from the door. I kept my eye pressed against the peephole. Instead of turning around and walking away immediately, he just stood at the edge of my porch, looking around. He slowly turned his head toward my front windows, then toward the dark side of the house, and then looked right back at the front door. After about 15 seconds of this, he finally walked down the driveway. Once again, there was no vehicle anywhere in sight. That was the moment when everything started to feel deeply wrong. On the 3rd night, there were no knocks. I actually felt an immense wave of relief wash over me. I thought that maybe he had finally figured out his mistake and moved on. I even made a little joke to myself about how bizarre it would have been if he actually showed up for a 3rd time. But on the 4th night, that relief completely vanished. It was around 9 o'clock in the evening, and I was in the kitchen washing dishes. Suddenly, I heard 4 knocks, but the problem was they did not come from the front door. They came from the side of the house, right against my dining room window. I froze, holding a wet plate in my hands. I slowly walked into the dining room and stared at the window, but I could not see anyone through the glass. Then, almost instantly, 4 more heavy knocks echoed from the front door. My heart began to pound. I hurried over to the peephole and looked through. It was him again, but this time something was different. He was not holding a box anymore. His hands were completely empty. I stayed absolutely silent, hoping he would think nobody was home. He knocked again, harder this time. Then he stepped back and stared directly at the peephole, almost as if he knew I was standing right there looking at him. I quickly backed away from the door, making sure not to make a single sound or cause any movement that might show through the lens. After about 30 seconds, he finally turned around and walked away. I waited for 5 full minutes, letting the silence stretch out, before I dared to check the windows. I walked through the house with all the lights turned off, carefully parting the blinds just a fraction of an inch to look outside. And that was when I saw him. He was standing directly across the street, right near the tree line. He was completely motionless, just standing there in the dark, facing my house. After about a minute of watching him, he turned and disappeared into the shadows of the woods. I went around the entire house and relocked every single window and door, even though I knew they were already locked. The very next day, I decided I had enough. I called the local police non-emergency line and explained the entire situation to the officer on duty. The officer listened carefully and told me that this sounded like a classic case of someone trying to verify occupancy. He explained that burglars will often knock on doors to see if anyone answers before they attempt to break in later on. He advised me to install some security cameras if I could, and told me to call 911 immediately if the man returned. That night, I decided to play it safe. I left all the front lights of the house completely off and stayed in my bedroom at the back. Right on cue, around 8:45, I heard those 4 familiar knocks at the front door. I stayed completely still and did not respond. A few seconds later, there were 4 more knocks, followed by a heavy silence. I waited in the dark, holding my breath. A minute went by, and then I heard a brand new sound. It was a soft, dull thud against the back of the house, followed by another one. I suddenly realized what was happening. Someone was testing my back door. I grabbed my phone, slipped out of bed, and quietly walked into the hallway. From there, I could clearly hear the metal doorknob of the back door slowly turning. It would turn, stop, and then turn again. I immediately dialed 911, keeping my voice down to a terrified whisper, and told the dispatcher that someone was actively trying to break into my house. While I was on the phone, the knocking suddenly started up again at the front door. The dispatcher assured me that officers were already on their way to my location, but the back doorknob just kept turning, and then I heard a light, metallic scraping sound against the door frame. It sounded like someone was trying to jam a tool into the lock. It became clear to me that there was more than one person out there. After about 30 agonizing seconds, all the noises suddenly stopped. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher in absolute silence until I finally saw the flashing blue lights of the police cars reflecting through my windows. When the officers searched the exterior of the house, they found fresh pry marks on the back door right next to the handle. One of the officers told me straight out that if I had not been home to secure the house and call them, the door would have likely been forced wide open. They searched the surrounding neighborhood, but could not find anyone suspicious that night. The next evening, I decided I could not stay there anymore. I packed a small bag and went to stay at my brother's apartment on the other side of town. I made sure not to post anything about my whereabouts on social media. I just left. Around 9 o'clock that night, my phone started ringing. It was my neighbor who lived 2 houses down. She asked me if I was home because she could see someone standing on my front porch, knocking repeatedly. She said he had been standing there for at least 5 minutes. I told her I was not home and asked if he had a car parked nearby. She said she did not see any vehicle at all. I asked her to call the police right away. When the officers arrived, they found the man still on my porch and began questioning him. Later that night, an officer called me to give me an update. He said the man claimed he was simply trying to deliver a package but had somehow misplaced it. However, he did not have any company identification, no delivery uniform, and no marked vehicle. The police gave him a strong warning to stay away from the property and let him go. But the story did not end there. Just 2 days later, the police arrested the exact same man in a nearby neighborhood. He had been caught red-handed attempting to break into a house whose owners were away on vacation. When the police searched his car, they found several empty cardboard boxes and a small handheld scanner that was completely fake and not connected to any real delivery company. During his interrogation, he finally admitted to his entire method. He confessed that he would knock on doors holding a fake package as a test. If someone answered, he would pretend it was a mistaken delivery, leave, and mark the house as occupied. But if nobody answered after multiple attempts, he would return later that night to force his way inside. He even told the detectives that he would sometimes knock several nights in a row just to study the patterns of the residents. If he saw lights on one night and completely dark the next, he would assume the residents were out and that the house was safe to rob. Hearing those words sent a cold shiver down my spine. I realized just how incredibly close I had come to disaster during that first week. If I had decided to ignore the door on those early nights, he probably would have broken in while I was asleep or away. 3 months later, as soon as my lease was up, I packed my things and moved out of that house. To this day, I still refuse to answer the door at night unless I know exactly who is coming. If I hear an unexpected knock, I stay completely quiet and check my security cameras first. And if anyone ever shows up on my porch with a package that has my address but not my name, I do not even think about going near the door. Now, let us move on to another story that took place during a time of year that is supposed to be filled with joy and family warmth, but instead turned into an absolute nightmare. This event began in the cold winter days leading up to Christmas in a town near Glasgow, Scotland. At the time I was 16 years old, just about to turn 17. I lived in a lovely home with my parents, my siblings, and our family dogs and cats. We were a very close family, and we loved spending our winter evenings together in the living room, watching movies, playing games, and just catching up on each other's lives. It was one of those cozy nights when we were all gathered around the television watching A Christmas Carol. This was a classic tradition for us, and I always looked forward to it. But right in the middle of the movie, we heard a sudden knock at the front door. Since it was the holiday season, we did not think much of it, assuming it might be a neighbor or a delivery. My mom got up from her chair and went to answer it, but when she opened the door, the front porch was completely empty. There was nobody there. Our garden wrapped all the way from the front of the house to the back, so she checked the side paths, but she found absolutely nothing. She came back inside, slightly confused, and we went back to watching our movie. A few days later, I was sitting at the living room table, focusing hard on some exam preparation work. The house was quiet when suddenly I heard that same knock at the front door. I put my pen down, got up, and went to open it. Once again, there was absolutely nobody there. The street was completely still. At that point, we all assumed it must be some local neighborhood kids playing a prank. In Scotland, there is a very common game that kids play called chappie. The rules are simple. Kids run up to a house, knock as hard as they can, and then run away laughing to hide. It is a silly game, but for kids, the quick rush of adrenaline from seeing an adult open an empty door is strangely exciting. We had a family group chat where we would keep each other updated, and over the course of that week, several other family members posted that they had experienced the exact same random knocks. But the one incident that really started to worry us happened to my dad. My dad was a bit of a night owl back then. He would usually stay up much later than the rest of the house, either playing video games on his Xbox or watching television once everyone else had gone to sleep. One night around 11:30, when the entire street was completely silent and all the neighborhood kids were definitely inside their homes, my dad heard a very quiet, gentle knock on the door. He was immediately confused because of how late it was. He walked over to the door and looked through the peephole first, but he did not see anyone. He slowly unlocked the door and opened it to look out into the night. The street was totally empty and silent. He locked the door back up, came upstairs, and asked if any of us had heard the noise. But because the knock had been so incredibly quiet, the rest of us had been fast asleep and heard nothing. This was the moment when a strange feeling of unease began to settle over the household. It was happening too often, and yet nobody had ever seen or heard anyone running away. Usually, when kids play chappie, you can hear them whispering, giggling, or running down the pavement. But with these knocks, there was only ever-dead silence. It felt like someone was standing there, knocking, and then just vanishing into thin air. When Christmas Day finally arrived, we tried to put the weird occurrences out of our minds. We spent the entire day opening presents, sharing gifts, playing family games, and eating far too much food. It was a wonderful, happy day. But later that night, all that rich holiday food started to catch up with me, and I began to feel really sick to my stomach. I decided to go upstairs to my bedroom to lie down for a bit. I ended up falling asleep and woke up much later. I reached over to check my phone, and the screen read 2:01 in the morning. The entire house was pitch black and completely silent. Everyone else had gone to bed hours ago. I knew right away that I would not be able to fall back asleep, because once I wake up in the middle of the night, my mind starts racing and sleep becomes impossible. So I just stayed in bed, scrolling through social media on my phone in the dark, watching videos of people showing off their Christmas presents, and texting a few friends who were also still awake. It is that typical holiday break behavior when you do not have school or any real responsibilities, and you just want to enjoy the late night freedom. But then, in the middle of the silence, I heard a very faint, muffled knock. I froze. I could not tell if the sound had come from my bedroom door, my window, or if my mind was just playing tricks on me because of all the weird events from the previous weeks. I sat up straight in my bed, staring into the darkness of my room with my heart pounding against my ribs. I was too terrified to move. I knew for a fact that absolutely nobody should be outside our house at 2 in the morning on Christmas night. My bedroom was on the second floor of the house, so the idea of someone knocking on my window seemed almost impossible. After what felt like an eternity, I finally gathered enough courage to get out of bed and open my bedroom door. But just as I cracked it open, I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. My brain instantly tried to rationalize it. I thought it must be my dad coming up to bed after staying up late to play his games. I stepped out onto the landing, fully intending to tell him that I was still awake, but as I reached the top of the stairs, I realized with absolute horror that it was not my dad. Standing on the stairs was a complete stranger, A man I had never seen before in my entire life. I felt a wave of pure sickness wash over me. I wondered if this was the person who had been knocking on our door all those weeks. And now he was already inside our home. He was staggering and swaying as he climbed the steps, looking heavily intoxicated. I slowly backed away into my bedroom, desperately praying he would not notice me. Fortunately, he was too disoriented to look up, and I managed to quietly shut my door. I stood there, listening intently, as his footsteps shuffled around the landing. I could hear him opening doors, walking into one room after another. I realized with sheer panic that it was only a matter of time before he reached my door. I was completely frozen. All my logic and sense seemed to vanish in that moment of pure terror. After a few moments, I gently cracked my door open again to see where he was. I saw him stumbling out of my younger sister's bedroom. Seeing him near my sister's room finally snapped my brain back into action. I slipped out of my room, ran straight to my parents' bedroom, and shook them awake, whispering frantically that there was an intruder inside the house. My mom woke up instantly, but my dad was still groggy and confused. We all crept downstairs together to see what was happening. When we reached the living room, we were shocked to find the man completely passed out on our couch. He had found my dad's beer bottles, opened several of them, and scattered them all over the floor around him. My mom immediately lost her temper and began shouting at him to get out of our house. The man stirred slightly, opened his eyes, and angrily started insisting that this was his house, and that we were the ones who needed to leave. We tried to pull him up, but his body was completely limp, like dead weight. My mom even slapped him across the face to try and wake him up, but he barely reacted. Just then, my dad came fully down the stairs, saw the situation, and immediately took charge. He roared at the man, telling him in no uncertain terms that he did not live here, and that he had to get out immediately. The man stubbornly refused. Seeing no other option, my dad physically grabbed the man, lifted him off the couch, and dragged him toward the side door of the house. He shoved him out into the cold night, and warned him never to show his face here again, before slamming the door shut and locking it. We all stood there, breathing heavily, thinking the nightmare was finally over. But just seconds later, a violent crash shattered the silence. The man had swung his fist and punched directly through the glass window next to the door. Shards of broken glass flew everywhere, scattering across the floor. Then, he pushed his bleeding face right through the broken pane, staring at us with wild eyes, looking exactly like that famous scene from the movie The Shining. While my dad ran to grab the phone to call the police, the man began screaming terrifying threats at us. He kept shouting that he owned the house now, that he knew exactly what all of our faces looked like, and that he was going to come back to get us. We were all in a state of absolute shock and terror. It was hard to process that something so violent and bizarre was happening to us on Christmas night. After a few minutes of screaming, the man finally stumbled away into the darkness. Shortly after, the police arrived at our house and began taking detailed statements from all of us. Since I was the one who had spotted him on the stairs first, my statement took the longest. Fortunately, because it was the middle of winter, it had actually snowed that night. In our part of Scotland, we usually just get wet slush, so having actual fresh snow on the ground was quite rare. And that snow turned out to be the key to finding him. There was a very clear, bright trail of red blood leading right down our street. The police officers followed the bloody tracks easily, and they led them straight to a nearby neighborhood playground. There, lying on the ground in the snow, they found the man. His hands were covered in cuts and embedded with shards of broken glass. They arrested him on the spot and confirmed to us that they believed he was the intruder. The very next morning, we had our broken window replaced. We sat down and explained everything to my younger siblings, who had miraculously slept through the entire chaotic ordeal, probably because they were completely exhausted from all the Christmas excitement and food. Because of my age and the terrifying threats the man had made toward us, I was granted a formal restraining order against him. He was eventually fined for the property damage and sentenced to community service instead of jail time. During his police interrogation, the detectives questioned him about the weeks of mysterious knocking that had occurred before his break-in, but the man swore he knew absolutely nothing about that. He denied ever coming near our house before that night. It turned out that he actually used to live in our house many years before my family had moved in. He claimed that he had no bad intentions whatsoever, saying he had simply had far too much to drink while out celebrating with his friends, and had accidentally walked into his old home by mistake. We were incredibly grateful that nobody in our family was seriously injured. The only actual injury was a bruised wrist that my mom got from slapping him while wearing heavy metal bracelets. It turns out that slapping someone while wearing jewelry hurts you a lot more than it hurts them. But to this day, we have never found any explanation for the strange knocking sounds that plagued our house in the weeks leading up to that night. Even now, all these years later, I sometimes think I hear a faint knock at the door late at night. Sometimes I wonder if it is just my imagination playing tricks on me, or if there really was someone else out there in the dark, watching our house and waiting for the right moment. I suppose I will never truly know the answer. Our next story takes us back to around the year 2010, when I was just a young child of about 6 years old. My family was living in a quiet, cozy neighborhood in the city of Springfield, Oregon. Our household consisted of my mother, my older brother, my older sister, and myself. My dad was not with us at the time because he was deployed overseas with the military. I was extremely close with my dad, and whenever he was away for long stretches of time, it was always very hard on me. One late evening, it was pouring rain outside. My mom went out onto the front porch to have a cigarette, and I decided to sit out there with her to watch the rain fall. Even though it was quite cold and damp, I really enjoyed just sitting there in the quiet, spending that peaceful time with my mother. But as we were watching the rain bounce off the pavement, we noticed something strange. A man was walking right down the middle of our street. What made him stand out immediately was that he was wearing a very bright, oversized yellow rain jacket. It was a striking sight because it was incredibly late at night, the rain was coming down in sheets, and there was absolutely nobody else out on the road. My mom and I both watched him closely. As he got closer to our house, he began to steer his path slightly toward our driveway. My mom immediately stood up, put her cigarette out, and grabbed my hand tightly. We stood there on the porch and watched as the man came to a complete stop right next to the garbage cans at the edge of our driveway. My mom turned around to quickly usher me inside the safety of the house, and that was when the man suddenly began to scream at us. I cannot remember the exact words he was yelling, but I will never forget the absolute terror I felt as my mom hurried me through the front door. The moment we were inside, my mom locked the door shut and immediately turned off all the lights in the house, plunging us in darkness. I was absolutely terrified. Being only 6 years old, I burst into tears. My mom quickly gathered my siblings and me, shushing us gently, and led us all into my parents' large king-sized bed. We all huddled together under the blankets, feeling incredibly anxious and worried about the strange man outside. But as the minutes ticked by, nothing else happened. There was no more yelling, no strange noises, and no signs of the man. Eventually, the warmth of the bed overcame our fear, and we all drifted off to sleep. But that night I had a horrible, vivid nightmare that I can still picture perfectly to this day. In the dream, I saw a man wearing that same massive yellow rain jacket, standing right outside our bedroom window, peering in at us through the glass. I woke up from the nightmare in a state of pure panic, crying and shaking uncontrollably. I reached over and shook my sister awake, crying as I told her how scared I was. I have no idea what time it actually was. My sister got out of bed and walked me to the master bathroom that was attached directly to the bedroom. She shut the door behind us and sat with me, talking to me in quiet whispers to help calm me down without waking up our mom or brother. But while we were sitting there in the bathroom, a sudden violent noise shattered the quiet. It was a loud, aggressive banging on our front door. My sister gasped, threw the bathroom door open, and ran over to my mom's side of the bed, shaking her awake as fast as she could without saying a word. My brother woke up instantly from the loud noise too. I sat frozen on the bathroom floor, completely terrified, as my mom gestured for my brother and sister to quickly join me inside the bathroom. We all huddled together on the floor, crying and shaking with fear, while the heavy, rhythmic banging on the front door continued to echo through the dark house. My mom went out into the hallway, trying to find her old BlackBerry phone so she could call the police. But in her panic, she could not find it anywhere. That meant we had absolutely no way to call for help. We sat there in the dark bathroom, listening to the man outside. He was not just knocking anymore. He was screaming at the top of his lungs, demanding that we let him inside, all while slamming his fists against the door. It was the most helpless, terrifying night of my entire life. It was just my mom and her 3 young children, with no phone, and my dad was thousands of miles away. We huddled close on the bathroom floor, crying and praying that one of our neighbors would hear the commotion and call the police. But nobody did. Eventually, the screaming and banging faded away, and the man left. No police ever showed up. What was so bizarre to us was that our neighborhood was quite small, with the houses built very close together. Our house was actually a duplex, sharing a wall with another family. How not a single neighbor managed to hear a grown man screaming and slamming on a door in the middle of the night was completely beyond us. Eventually, we managed to get back to sleep, and for a few weeks, everything seemed to return to normal. But the peace did not last long. Not even a month later, while it was still just the 5 of us in the house, my family woke up one morning to a chilling sight. Our front door was standing wide open. Not only that, but one of our windows was pushed open, and there was a giant, clean hole cut directly through the window screen. My mom immediately grabbed her phone and called the police. As we went through the house, we realized that several random items were missing. My piggy bank, which contained all of my holiday savings, was gone. Other random household items had been taken as well, but by far the most disturbing thing that was stolen was a large glass vase. For months, our family had been filling this vase with spare cash and coins, saving up for a special occasion, and the absolute most sickening part of it all was where that vase had been sitting. It had been placed right on my nightstand, directly next to the bed where my sister and I had been sleeping soundly all night. The thought that an intruder had stood right next to our sleeping bodies in the dark was absolutely horrifying. Because this happened so long ago, and because my mother has sadly passed away since then, many of the details of the police investigation have been lost to time. My dad was not there when the actual break-in occurred, so he could not fill in the blanks either. We never found out for sure if the intruder was ever officially caught by the authorities. I also still do not know to this day if the aggressive man in the yellow rain jacket was the same person who broke into our home weeks later. It could have been connected, or it could have been a completely different criminal. But there was one strange detail that we noticed later on. A few weeks after the burglary, I happened to look over at the porch of one of our neighbors. He was a quiet man who lived completely alone, and we rarely ever saw him leave his house. But sitting right there on his front porch was a large glass vase that looked identical to the one that had been stolen from my nightstand. We never got proof, and we never knew for sure, but the sight of it always left a lingering, unsettling feeling in my chest. This final story took place about 3 years ago, while I was living in Idaho serving a full-time religious mission. The small town where my companion, whom I will call Spencer, and I were assigned was incredibly small and remote. Because of how quiet the area was, there was not always a lot of work for us to do. To make matters worse, I was going through a really difficult personal patch at the time, struggling with low self-esteem and sleep issues. As a result of all this stress, Spencer and I found it really hard to stay out working all day long, so we spent a lot of time resting at home. We were renting a very tiny house, which was our only real option because there were simply no apartment buildings nearby. The layout of our tiny home was extremely simple. When you walked through the front door, you immediately stepped into the main living room where our desks were set up. To your immediate right was our bedroom door. If you kept walking straight, you would pass through a wide open doorway leading directly into the kitchen. Once you were in the kitchen, the bathroom was on your right, and the laundry room was on your left. It is also important to note that our landlord's house was located right next door, only a short distance away. If we ever ran into any issues, we could easily walk over or give him a quick phone call. On the night this happened, it had gotten dark quite early. Spencer and I were relaxing before going to bed. I was sitting at my desk in the living room, looking at my phone, while Spencer was sitting on his bed in the other room. In the middle of the quiet evening, I suddenly heard a single, distinct knock. It came from the kitchen window right above the sink. Because of our house layout, anyone standing at that kitchen window would have a clear view of the entire living area where I was sitting. I looked up immediately, but all I could see was the pitch black night. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling myself it must have just been a tree branch brushing against the glass. But the more I thought about it, the more unlikely that seemed. None of the tree branches were close enough to touch the window. Just as I was having this thought, another knock sounded. This time, it came from the window in the laundry room around the corner. A heavy feeling of dread settled in my stomach. I called out to Spencer to tell him what I was hearing, but as the words left my mouth, a third knock sounded. It came from the living room window, directly next to where I was sitting. I did not look to see who was on the other side. I bolted from my chair, ran into the bedroom, and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. I asked Spencer if he had heard it too, and his wide eyes told me everything. He had. We began to whisper frantically, debating what we should do. The only potential weapons we had in the entire house were a couple of small kitchen knives, and we had no idea how many people were outside, or if they were carrying weapons. Going outside to confront them was completely out of the question. As we were trying to decide on a plan, the knocking sound moved once again. This time it came from the front door itself. The knocks were steady and deliberate, and we were getting more and more terrified by the second. We talked about calling the police, but we were so far out in the middle of nowhere that we knew it would take a very long time for them to reach us. That was when Spencer remembered we had our landlord's phone number. He quickly dialed the number and began explaining the emergency. By this point, the knocking at the front door had stopped, but I knew what was coming next, and I was absolutely dreading it. Sure enough, a few seconds later, the knocks came directly against our bedroom window. Spencer told the landlord what was happening, and the landlord told us to stay exactly where we were. He said he was grabbing his shotgun and would be right over. We waited in total silence for several minutes, holding our breath, but nothing happened. Finally, we heard our landlord's voice calling out to us from the front door. We unlocked the bedroom door and let him in. He told us that as he was walking over, he saw a pickup truck suddenly speed away down the dark road. He said it was already too far away in the dark for him to see any details. Spencer and I grabbed our flashlights, and together with our landlord, we went outside to inspect the property. There were still a few small patches of snow left on the ground from a winter storm. In those patches of snow, we found a clear set of footprints circling the entire house, going from window to window. As far as we could tell, there was only one set of tracks. We debated calling the police to report it, but we knew they would have a hard time finding a random truck with no license plate. Our landlord told us to call him immediately if the truck returned, and then he went back to his house. We locked every lock, turned off the lights, and tried to get some sleep, but neither of us could close our eyes. We wondered if it could have been other missionaries playing a mean prank on us, but if it was, they never revealed themselves or said anything afterward. Plus, it was way past our strict curfew. We also wondered if it was local teenagers, but a prank like that is usually done in a group, and we had only found one single set of footprints. We asked around the community over the next few weeks, but nobody ever confessed to doing it. To this day, I still have no idea who was outside our house that night, or why they chose to target us. But the absolute scariest part of the entire experience was realizing that when the very first knock happened at the kitchen window, I had looked directly at that window. That means I was likely staring right into the eyes of the stalker in the dark, and I did not even realize it. From that night on, my sleeping issues only grew much worse, and my personal struggles did not improve. I ended up leaving the area eventually, and I know for a fact that I will never set foot near that tiny house again. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.